Lithebe is the Accenture security lead for Africa. We're going to be having a fantastic discussion on where we are on the continent with the security risks that are being posed. It's been 2 years since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the initial sprint to digitize has matured into long-term digital transformation across the industry sectors. And it's been fascinating to watch over the last 2 years. The pace of technology has been extraordinary, accelerated with the need for business to fast track their digital transformation, both in how they serve their customers and manage their workforces. Now, in this particular episode, we will make sense of the leading technologies that are shaping strategic conversations and how these technologies are making an impact in a South African context. Most importantly, we will discuss how to implement transformation technologies and drive innovation in a way that is secure from the start. So what a great pleasure it is to welcome you, Boland. Thank you so much for joining me. I mean, I'm sure you as a professional and both you and I are very passionate in this. I mean, the last 2 years have just been extraordinary in the digitization that organizations have had to transform with their workforces working remotely. I've never seen anything like it in my
Oh,
career.
definitely. Thanks, Aki, and good morning to your viewers. Yes, I mean the COVID pandemic has really changed the landscape in terms of digital transformation. You know that many organizations have for the past 10 years been on this journey of digital transformation, and others have been successful, others not so successful. But when the COVID pandemic started 2 years ago, it fast tracked digital transformation, and that had security connotations. How do you then protect the organization now that the boundary has now moved outside of the traditional office space into anywhere your employees could be? So it really changed and fast tracked the digital transformation.
Oh, it's absolutely fascinating, and I've been reading quite a bit of the research that Accenture's been putting out, and the trends. It's really quite fascinating what you're picking up from the businesses that you guys are, involved in and consulting with. I mean, when you look at the trends that are having an impact on the IT and OT landscape, well, what would you say What would you say those
Well,
are?
actually, we are continuing to see increase in the ransomware attacks and the evolution of ransomware. We are seeing increased speed of delivery techniques, the sophistication of the ransomware attacks, and these groups launching these attacks are working together. The sharing ideas and they sort of corporatizing a ransomware attack. I mean, we've seen in the US Colonial Pipeline how it was attacked, and they paid the ransom and they never got their data back, or at least they didn't fully recover from that incident. And we've seen many others in Iran where the Iran railways was attacked by ransomware, and many other places. I mean, we know about locally here that we've seen a lot of ransomware attacks published in the media, and we also are seeing crimeware. You know, they steal data and they sell it on the dark web, and we have seen a credit bureau in South Africa in the past weeks having been attacked, and these guys are clever. We have seen now that they not just attack an organization, they also use your third parties to pressure you to pay the ransomware. I mean, we've read on the media that this credit bureau has been now being pressured, or the hacker groups are now talking directly to the third parties to say, hey, if you don't pressure the victim, we are going to release the information about you as a third party, not necessarily the victim. So
Mm.
it's a really organized and well-funded threat groups.
That's actually quite scary, Boland. I mean, we hear about these things globally, and we hear them about them locally, and it really can cripple a business. And just to your point, I mean, the fact that these guys are collaborating together, they seem to be getting very creative in their approaches, right? I mean, they're thinking out of the box, they're thinking laterally. And these kind of things have a devastating effect on organizations. And the problem is, how do you mitigate that risk, and how do you actually protect against these kind of attacks that many organizations face every single day,
Yeah,
actually.
it's really a difficult and challenging task. Particularly, I can remember if you are a business, you will have your third parties, right? People connecting to your
Yes.
organization, and and now you can secure yourself, but what about your third parties? That's some of the things that organization needs to start looking at. Broader risk assessment to understand what is the security of the people connecting to you. And I think this touches on one of the topics that we are going to discuss around Protection of Personal Information Act. That one of the elements of the act is that when you share information, as the data collector, you need to make sure that the receiving party has enough protection for that particular data that you are sharing. So again, it goes back to the third party risk assessment. You need to make sure that your third parties have got their basics right. And you also need to ensure that you've got proper incident response. When things happen, and they will
Mm,
happen,
mm.
you've got a plan on how you're going to address those things. Companies also needs to collaborate more with their industry peers to share ideas, to share threats, to share how best they can
Yes.
approach these threat groups. Without that, the threat groups guys are collaborating. They are working together. They are sharing ideas to deliver more devastating attacks.
Yeah.
So companies needs to start forming industry groups that will look at this topic specifically to have an approach on how they're going to deal with it.
Boland, I really like what you said. I mean, if these guys are collaborating on how to attack your organizations, I mean, organizations are all in silos at the moment, and very few are collaborating in terms of what the security risks are, what they're doing, sharing ideas. I mean, let's unpack that for a second, because I mean, it's such a great point that you make. I mean, what would your advice be to clients to simultaneously introduce and scale their cloud operations and secure their network? I mean, you did say about collaboration, you did mention about making sure that you understand where those third parties are, but there's a lot more that people can do. What are your thoughts on
Well,
that?
you see, many organizations are going through this cloud journey and migrating more close to the cloud. The best policy is always to secure from the start. Bake security in as you start the journey, and and build the standards and compliance from day one, so that you can start to understand that every step of the way you can go back to the standard and compliance and say, I need to comply to this thing. What are the regulatory requirements for this data that I'm moving to the cloud? Am I compliant? What are the security standards that we as an organization have adopted, and are they applicable, or do we need to change them as we move to the cloud? And organization also needs to adapt to how businesses and ICT landscape has changed, and make sure that they've got enough, I would say, business or organizational culture to accommodate change in a secure manner.
Okay, now I love what you said about baking it in from the beginning, right? I mean, that's the way it should be. That's the core of the business operation. And start thinking about security first. And it's interesting you say that, and you look at the analysis that's been done by organizations like the World Economic Forum, for example, and many of the top research that's coming out abroad, and the research coming out from Accenture, highlighting that cyber threats are in the top three, if not the most biggest risk globally to the stability in the world. And in fact, they're placing, even COVID, for example, has dropped down that list. Cyber is above COVID right now, just in terms of the risks that we face. And of course, with organizations adding additional layers, you mentioned the cloud operations, and there's a lot more
Yes.
complexity in organizations' networks today, and I guess that must be quite a daunting task for many organizations. How do you secure so much
Correct.
complexity?
Yeah, I was chatting to a chief information security officer of an organization here in South Africa, and I was encouraged by the discussion around the maturity of C-level executives in South Africa in understanding the risks around cyber and related technologies. And what she said was they have adopted in their organization a zero priority for information security. That means when there is an information security threat risk, it takes number one priority over their actual business activities. And I think that starts to tell you that, as you have mentioned again, World Economic Forum talking about cyber as one of the top risks globally. It is true that we have seen with a colonial pipeline in the US that the northeastern side of the US didn't have the fuel for a number of days because of the attack. So these are
Mm,
devastating. There is a water treatment plant that was attacked in the US as well, where the hackers started
yes.
messing with the chemical content of the treatment chemicals into the water. I mean, that's life threatening. If that water is released to the public without detection, it might have serious uh, life threatening or even death in that population. So cyber is really and truly a very critical risk that organization needs to pay attention to and take very seriously.
Mm. It's interesting how many people are adopting what you said, the zero trust attitude. So I guess what you're saying as well is that when it comes to ransomware threats, you must assume that you've already been breached at all times, right? You need to be switched on, have all of those measures in place all the time, and act and enforce those security measures as if you've been breached.
Correct. And that mentality assists organization during a breach, right? The organization needs to do simulations. They need to be prepared, not just the IT function within organization, all the way up to the board, to simulate how they would react when a ransomware happens. So other breaches like distributed denial of service, organization needs to have that I would say understanding of cyber at that level. The communications department needs to communicate better with the public when these breaches happen. The legal department needs to understand what to report to law enforcement and other regulatory bodies, like the information regulator in our case in South Africa for breaches of personally identifiable information. So basically what we are saying as Accenture is that cybersecurity is a team sport, right? It needs perfect execution of the basics. Get the basics right. Uh, get different capabilities within the team so that you can have a cohesive team understanding the risk and ready to react when things go bad.
Mm. No, I think those are the really wise words, and I do think, and I've been talking to a few organizations and asking this about what do you guys do when you do have an attack, and what you said just now is that you almost have to uh, act as if it's happening because you will react a lot better when it does happen. Um, and how many organizations need to start deploying a SOC, for
Mm.
example, a security operations center? Is that one of the things that is kind of a necessity in 2022 going forward? When you look at the threat response and you look at the threats that are hitting organizations, a security operations center surely is critical in most
Absolutely. I mean,
organizations.
imagine Aki driving a car without a dashboard. You don't understand the speed that you are driving. You don't understand the engine temperature. You don't know if you've got enough oil, enough fuel. So imagine driving a car like that. It's very risky, very dangerous. Organization must have consistent monitoring of their environment to ensure that they are able to detect threats and be proactive in how they deal with information security. Security operations center are critical because if you don't have it, you'll never know when you are hit. You will see the breach if you are lucky, or you will hear that your customer data has been released on the dark web, and it's late at that point, because then it's going to be expensive to recover from an incident like that. Therefore, that's why security operations center are so critical in ensuring that you've got that visibility across all the aspects of your network and infrastructure. So very critical.
Yeah, and of course, the collaboration that you talk about, once you've got that, you're starting to form this cyber threat
Yes.
intelligence, right? And you better understand how these criminals are working. You better understand the modus operandi, the kinds of threats that you're building up. So having that intelligence to understand the cyber threats is equally
Correct,
important.
yes. And again, we spoke earlier, Aki, about the industry peers and collaboration, and that's why the threat
Yes.
intelligence come into play, where you can have a look at the sectoral intelligence and what that means for your organization, and start putting mitigating steps in place before that threat happens to your environment. If you are in manufacturing and you have got certain industrial control systems from a certain manufacturer, and that industrial control system is vulnerable in Germany, it will be vulnerable in South Africa as well. So that intelligence
Mm-hmm.
brings a proactiveness into how you deal with cyber threats, to say, I know that this has happened elsewhere in the world. Let me go and patch my environment to protect myself against it. So threat intelligence is critical component of the security operations center, monitoring and understanding when you are putting threat feeds into the security operations center for better visibility, not just for your environment, but you also have to have that situational awareness of what's happening around you.
Boland, how do you think we as a country fare when we compare ourselves to the rest of the world and the continent as well? Now, I ask that, and I guess that the big organizations like the banks and the blue chip organizations, etc., they've got all that security in place, and I think it's on the same level as what you'd see with the global standards. But when you have so many small businesses in South Africa, I did read a report that South Africa and the continent per se lags a little bit behind when it comes to cybersecurity. So we really need to up our game. Where do you think we look like when we compare ourselves to the rest of the world? Are we right there with global standards, or are we lacking behind a little
I think
bit?
we are lagging behind a little bit, Aki, in terms of maturity and time to protection. And if you read a lot of research around ransomware as an example, that it's big in small and medium enterprises. And I'm glad you raised
Yes.
that issue around um, what is the landscape look like. It doesn't look good. But I can say that in the past 5 years, I've seen traction of many organizations, small organizations, making efforts to protect their environment, making efforts to at least have a capability to be able to stop ransomware, and to just that understanding that we are now working in cyber and we need to protect ourselves. I think that maturity is coming, but we're not at the developed world stage yet.
Okay, no, it's interesting. I mean, that's what I picked up. And of course, when you look at the heart of this economy with those small and medium sized
Yes.
businesses, it's really critical for us to be very aware of the cyber threats and protect ourselves. Now, Papia is one thing that scares the living daylights out of most organizations, and how you protect your data. What does Papia mean for South African businesses? And I guess that whenever you hear of these kind of breaches, the word Papia comes up automatically. And I, as a consumer, just with this recent threat you mentioned earlier about this credit organization, I have some of my
Mm,
records there, and I'm now questioning who has access to my data, who
mm.
has my bank accounts, who has my ID number. That petrifies me. And then Papia comes into it, and I think, how on earth am I, as a citizen, protected against these kind of
Yes,
incidents?
Popia, I think it's a very good legislation in ensuring that business, after collecting citizens' personal information, treat that information responsibly, and and they don't abuse the information, right? If you look at one of the aspects of the act, it says that the subject, the data subject, which is me, you, and everyone else in the country, must give consent, and that consent has got limitations, which is good because when I'm dealing with my salon to cut my hair, I don't want them tomorrow to be selling to be being contacted about insurance company because they've sold my data to an insurance company. I think it goes to the heart of, if you look at OECD guidelines in 1980 already, they were putting together guidelines around how organizations should deal with privacy and personally identifiable information, particularly when it has to cross borders. So I think it's what it means for South African companies. It puts a huge responsibility on those organizations collecting this data, on one, how they protect it, and who they share it with, and for what purpose, because that's sort of at the core of the legislation, to
Yes.
ensure that if an organization uh, collects that data, they've got the responsibility processing it, they've got the responsibility and disposing of it. It also gives us, as citizens, rights to call this organization and ask, what information do you have about me? So what does that mean for a business? That means the business has to start implementing all these channels, one for me as a citizen to call in and say, Mr. Company A, you, what information do you have about me, and what are you using it for? And I can also request for that information to be disposed of. So, so it means the whole business has to start thinking clearly about who has got access to this data, for what purpose, and how long are we going to keep this data before we dispose it. So I think it's a very good legislation. However, it puts a lot of responsibility on these companies to start implementing processes to comply to the legislation.
Boland, when you look at cybersecurity threats, I'm just amazed at what you when you compare over the last decade. It's just going like
Correct?
this,
Yes.
right? It's not slowing down at all. And you look at the forecast for this year, and it's like billions of dollars in ransomware, and the situation is really getting worse. It's growing exponentially out there. Do you ever think that we will get to a point where we will get this thing stabilized, or even a reduction in cyber threats going forward? But right now, it's a war out there that's happening with regards to security, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down at all.
Uh, Actually, I don't think in the near future we'll see a slowdown. If you look at the proliferation of Internet of Things, the bringing in of OT into the mainstream cybersecurity, it means that new threats are being discovered in these environments. It also increases the threat vector. And there's many places for the attack. And as innovation continues, innovation does not necessarily take security in most cases into account. IoT devices were innovated not saying, how do we secure this thing? They are great technology. But we now have to start thinking about, whoa, we've got all these great things. How do we protect them? That is why I'm saying in the near future we're still going to see a continuous increase in cyber threats.
Fascinating stuff. Well, listen, Boland, I really enjoyed chatting to you. Boland Lithebe, who is the Accenture security lead for Africa, talking about such an important topic. And I think that it's going to become increasingly important in organizations. You heard about the collaboration, that the criminals are collaborating with each other. They seem to be one step ahead of all of us when it comes to cybersecurity. And I think that we ourselves, in organizations, individuals, we need to be more aware. We need to collaborate. We need to take the advice that Boland has shared with us today. Boland, thank you so much for your time, and wish you well. And look forward to chatting to you again and getting another update on a fascinating topic.
Thanks, I can thank you for the fascinating topic. Goodbye.